The morning after my wife's funeral, I opened her personal safe. At the bottom, a sealed envelope. Do not open until they ask for money. My son-in-law called the next morning. Then again. Then he named a number. That's when I broke the seal. What I found inside changed everything. They thought they were hiding it from a grieving old fool. They didn't know this grieving old fool spent 30 years hunting people exactly like them. Before continuing, subscribe to our new channel, where we tell stories about men who take revenge on their insolent children, sons-in-law, and daughters-in-law. My name is Ernest Coleman. I'm 68 years old and I live in Charleston, South Carolina, in the same house on 4 Wentworth Lane that I've owned for 31 years. 3 stories, creaking oak floors, tall windows that face the street. I spent my career with the Criminal Investigation Division of the U.S. Department of the Treasury, tracking financial crimes, tax fraud, money laundering. The kind of work where you learn to read what people don't say louder than what they do. I retired 4 years ago. These days, I restore antique marine chronometers in the basement workshop. Broken ships, clocks from the 18th and 19th centuries, things most people would throw away. I find them, take them apart, screw by screw, and make them run again. It requires patience. It requires silence. It requires the ability to look at something damaged and understand exactly where it went wrong. As hobbies go, it's Swima. Our daughter Rebecca is 36. She has an MBA from the University of South Carolina and a talent for decorating rooms that belong to other people. She married Christopher Bennett. Chris, 6 years ago, he's 38. Works as a financial consultant at Palmetto Wealth Advisors on Broad Street. Chris is the kind of man who always looks slightly better dressed than the occasion requires. At family dinners, he gave toasts that were somehow more about his own trajectory than the person being celebrated, charming in the specific way that people are charming. When charm is a professional tool, practiced, calibrated, and always angled slightly towards something he wants. They moved in 3 years ago temporarily. Rebecca said Chris had a real estate investment that needed 6 months to stabilize, and it made more sense to save on rent during that window. Sylvia agreed before I could calculate what temporarily might mean in practice. I love my daughter. I chose not to make it a battle. Here is what temporarily looked like by month 8. Rebecca had reorganized the kitchen in a way I still can't fully navigate. Chris had taken to collecting the mail from the front box before I came downstairs, setting aside what he deemed relevant, and stacking the rest under a label he called household admin. He had opinions about which contractors to use for the roof repair, which financial advisor Sylvia should switch to, and whether my basement workshop constituted a liability from a homeowner's insurance standpoint. I noticed all of it. I said very little. Sylvia asked me once to give it time, so I gave it time. What I watched quietly over those 3 years was the steady narrowing of the space in which Sylvia and I operated. It happened the way a tide comes in. You don't see the water moving until you notice your feet are wet. Chris would mention casually that he'd spoken to Sylvia's financial advisor about optimizing the portfolio structure. Rebecca would ask with great warmth whether I'd thought about what would happen to the house down the road. There was always a document to look at, a decision that needed to happen now because the market was doing something complicated. And Sylvia, who had managed our household finances for 4 decades with the precision of a Swiss movement, grew quieter about money than I had ever known her to be. I noticed. I said nothing. The funeral was a full house. Sylvia had many friends, and Charleston turns out for its own. I stood in the receiving line for nearly 3 hours, shaking hands, thanking people I hadn't seen in years. The food that neighbors brought covered every surface of the dining room table. It was around 50 inches the afternoon, with maybe 30 people still in the house, when Chris touched my elbow and steered me gently toward the hallway. "Ernest," he said in the low, confidential register he uses when he wants you to feel like he's doing you a favor. "I know this is terrible timing, and I wouldn't bring it up today if it weren't genuinely time-sensitive. There are a few documents that need your attention. Nothing complicated. Just some joint asset management restructuring. Things that should have been handled sooner. Honestly, better for taxes, better for the estate. Sylvia and I had already discussed the general framework. He paused, letting that land. I could walk you through everything tomorrow if that works. I looked at him. I've spent 3 decades watching people deliver partial truths. And the specific texture of it, the careful pacing, the appeal to urgency, the dropped reference to someone who can no longer contradict the story is not something I forget just because I'm retired. Give me a couple of days, I said. He smiled. It was a good smile. Practiced, sympathetic, slightly patient. The way you smile at someone whose grief is an inconvenience you've graciously decided to accommodate. Of course, take all the time you need. I went back to thanking guests. An hour later, I walked upstairs to take a moment alone. I don't know what made me stop in the bedroom doorway. Maybe the angle of the light, maybe 31 years of professional habit, but I stopped. And I looked at the wall beside the closet. And I felt the cold clarity that arrives when something is wrong before you can name it. The door to Sylvia's personal safe was open, not fully, just a quarter inch, a dark gap where there should have been a flush surface. The electronic keypad showed a single red indicator light. A failed entry attempt. Someone had tried the combination and gotten it wrong. That safe had been closed without exception for every single day. That safe had been closed without exception for every single day I could remember. I crossed the room without turning on the light and examined the safe door. No pry marks. No damage to the frame. Someone had tried the combination and failed. I entered it myself. April 14th. 1981. The day Sylvia and I were married. The lock disengaged. Inside her good jewelry and a velvet roll. Our life insurance policy. The property deed. A folder of medical records. I checked each item carefully. Nothing was missing. But at the very bottom beneath the insurance documents were 2 things I hadn't known were there. The first was a small purple folder. I recognized Sylvia's handwriting on the tab. Neat capital letters. The kind she used when something was meant to be found, inside a single handwritten page. Not a letter exactly. More like the note someone leaves when they know they won't be there to explain in person. If you're reading this, she wrote, then I'm gone and they've already asked you for something. I didn't want to worry you while I was still here. I kept thinking I was misreading it. I kept thinking it would stop. But I watched it long enough to understand what it was. Check the registration of Magnolia Home Solutions, LLC. Look at the signatures on the documents Chris had me sign. Then compare those signatures to our 2019. Well, that was all. No extra explanation. Just a starting point written by a woman who knew her husband well enough to know he'd find the rest himself. I set the page on the bed and reached back into the safe. The second item was a thick envelope of heavy yellow paper, sealed with dark wax, written across the front in black marker. Do not open until they ask for money. I turned it over. The seal was intact. Unbroken. I put it back. She had left a specific condition. They hadn't met it yet. Chris had said documents. He'd said asset management restructuring. He hadn't said money. Not in those words. Whatever was inside that envelope. I was not opening it before the condition was satisfied. Sylvia had been precise about everything else in her life. I wasn't about to override her now. I went down to the basement. The workshop hasn't changed in years. Pegboard on the walls. Tools in their labeled places. The long bench under a line of adjustable lamps. In the center of the bench, partially disassembled, sat the 19th century ship's chronometer I'd been working on since autumn. The escapement mechanism needed complete reconstruction. Someone decades ago had attempted a repair with the wrong tools and left behind a subtle misalignment that had been quietly destroying the movement ever since. I could have replaced the damaged parts. I chose instead to understand exactly where the damage had started. I sat down on the stool and looked at it without touching anything. There's a kind of thinking I do best when my hands are still. I've done it in courtrooms and interrogation rooms and on back porches waiting for search warrants to clear. The kind where you stop trying to construct a conclusion and let the facts arrange themselves. Sylvia had been watching something long enough to build a file. She had left instructions about a specific company. She had compared signatures. She had sealed an envelope with a condition attached to it like a tripwire. I thought about Chris's hand on my elbow, the practice timing, the way he'd said Sylvia and I had already discussed the general framework, designed to make me feel the decision was half-aid by someone I trusted, by someone who could no longer say otherwise. I thought about 3 years of Sylvia growing quieter about money. I thought about the word temporarily. I didn't touch the chronometer. I sat there until the house went quiet, and I let the facts arrange themselves. The next morning, I was back at the bench by 7 when my phone rang. Chris, Ernie, Varm, measured, operating at what I'd come to think of as his professional frequency. The register he used when offering something while expecting something in return. I hope you got some rest. I know yesterday was incredibly hard. There are a few documents that really do need your attention soon. Rebecca's worried about the timeline. Would today work to sit down and go through everything? I watched the light coming through the small basement window. A harbor horn low and distant. Sure. Chris, I said, today works fine. A pause. Brief. But I caught it. He'd expected resistance. The absence of it recalibrated something in his thinking. Great. He said, I can have everything. Come by this afternoon. I said, I'll be here. I set the phone down and picked up my smallest screwdriver. The escapement wheel had 11 teeth, each one requiring individual examination before I could move to the next. I started with the first. By that point, I had already decided 3 things. First, I would read everything in that purple folder before the day was out. Second, I would find out exactly what Magnolia Home Solutions LLC was, who registered it, and what it had touched. Third, I would not sign a single document until I understood with complete precision what I was being asked to give away. The yellow envelope would wait. Sylvia's condition hadn't been met, but looking at Chris's name on my phone screen, thinking about the careful architecture of that call, the sympathy arriving on schedule, the urgency tucked inside the concern, the Rebecca's worried deployed like a lever. I felt the first quiet, cold stirring of something I recognized from a long time ago, the feeling I used to get at the beginning of a case when the shape of a scheme was just becoming visible through the noise, before you had the evidence, before you had the proof, when you had only the pattern. And the pattern was already telling you that someone had made a very serious miscalculation. They assumed I was grieving. They assumed grief makes you slow. I went back to work on the escapement wheel. 11 teeth, one at a time. I suggested the coffee shop, not the house. There's a place on King Street called Heron and Cup. Dark wood. Slow ceiling fans. The kind of place where tables are spaced far enough apart that a conversation stays private. I got there 12 minutes early and chose a seat facing the door. Old habit. I ordered black coffee and watched people come in off the street while I waited. Chris arrived exactly on time, which told me something. People who are confident they have leverage tend to be punctual. They want you to see them walk through the door. He was wearing a jacket despite the mild weather. A dark blazer over a light shirt. No tie. The carefully constructed version of casual that takes real effort to assemble. He spotted me, smiled the smile, and crossed the room with his hand already extended. Ernie. Good to see you. How are you holding up? Sitting down helps, I said. He laughed as though that were charming and pulled out the chair across from me. From the leather bag on his shoulder, he produced a brown folder, set it on the table between us, and ordered an espresso from the server without looking at the menu. A man who knows what he wants and expects it to arrive promptly. I really appreciate you making the time, he said. I know the last few days have been incredibly difficult. You mentioned documents, I said. He nodded, opening the folder with practiced efficiency, the kind that suggested he'd done this before, presented paperwork to people in unfavorable emotional conditions, and guided them toward a signature. 3 items, all straightforward. He turned the first page toward me. The first document was a quitclaim deed, the instrument of choice when someone wants to move real estate quickly, with minimal paperwork and minimal time for the signing party to grasp what they're surrendering. The property for Wentworth Lane Receiving Party Bennett Coleman Joint Management Trust, formatted to sound shared, while placing sole control with trustee Christopher A. Bennett. I read every word. Chris watched me the way you watch a slow reader at a restaurant menu. The second document changed the primary beneficiary on a $320,000 life insurance policy from my name to the same trust. The third transferred management authority over an investment account holding $412,000 to that trust with Chris as the sole authorized manager. I set the third page down and picked up my coffee. What's the tax exposure you're worried about? I asked. He was ready for that. He gave me a fluent 2-minute explanation about estate tax thresholds, stepped-up basis on inherited assets, and the administrative advantages of consolidated trust management. It was technically coherent. It was also structured to move very quickly past the part where I lost access to everything and arrive at the part where I was told this was good for me. I'll need a week, I said, earnest, a slight shift in his voice. Not impatient. But fermé. The way a salesman moves from warm to purposeful when the closing window narrows. The real estate market right now is genuinely unstable. The longer the property sits in any kind of administrative limbo, the more exposure there is. I really think we should. I looked up from my coffee. I said a week. Chris. He held my gaze for 2 seconds, recalibrated, and leaned back. Of course, he said. A week. Absolutely. We finished with the kind of small talk that exists purely to fill space after a negotiation stalls. He asked about my sleep. I told him it was fine. He mentioned that Rebecca was worried about me. I said that was kind of her. He paid the check. I let him, and we shook hands on the sidewalk outside. He walked back toward Broad Street. I stood there a moment and watched him go. I want to be precise about what I was thinking because it matters. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even particularly surprised. What I felt was the clean, quiet activation of something that had been dormant for 4 years. The part of me that had spent 3 decades reading documents exactly like the ones Chris had just placed in front of me, from exactly the kind of person who had just placed them there. A quick claim deed requires no warranty. It transfers whatever interest you have. It is the instrument of choice when someone wants to move property quickly and cleanly, with minimal paperwork and minimal time for the signing party to understand what they're giving up. I knew what a quick claim deed was when I was 32. Chris apparently had decided I'd forgotten. I drove home and opened my laptop at the kitchen table. The South Carolina Secretary of State maintains a public business entity search. It takes about 40 seconds to use. I typed in Magnolia Home Solutions LLC and hit enter. Registered 3 years prior. Registered agent Christopher A. Bennett. Director Derek Bennett. Principal Office. A Columbia Street address I didn't recognize. I printed the page, brought the purple folder down from the safe, and clipped the print out inside. Then I retrieved our 2019 will from the filing cabinet in the study, signed with a notary, reviewed by our attorney. Every clause examined before we touched the pen. I laid it open beside one of the documents from Chris's folder, the one carrying Sylvia's signature at the bottom. A signature is a B. Sylvia had signed her name the same way for decades. The capital S turning sharply left before looping forward. The C in Coleman closing almost into a full circle. The signature on our 2019 will did both of those things. The one on Chris's document did neither. I held both pages toward the afternoon light and felt something settle in my chest the way a lock engages when the right key finds it. The next morning I drove to King Street. I'd found Conrad Hayes through the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division's Public Registry of Licensed Private Investigators. Not a referral. Not a recommendation. Just the list. His office was on the second floor of a narrow building above a framing shop. Reached through a side door and a steep flight of stairs. The waiting area was one chair and a window overlooking the street below. He came out after about 3 minutes. Hayes was somewhere in his mid-50s. Unhurried in the way that either signals deep competence or deep indifference. In his case, I suspected the former. He listened without interrupting while I explained what I needed. A complete financial profile on Magnolia Home Solutions LLC. Whatever banking activity was publicly traceable on Derek Bennett over the previous 3 years. and a search for any additional LLCs registered under either Christopher or Derek Bennett in South Carolina or Delaware. Delaware, he said. That would be my first guess. 2. I said. He quoted me $3. 800. For an initial retainer and a 2-week preliminary timeline. I wrote the check and left him the purple folder. From King Street. I drove to Meeting Street. Patricia Ward's office was on the 4th floor of a narrow building near the corner of Broad. Her assistant showed me in without much waiting. Ward herself was around 60, with reading glasses on a beaded chain, and the precise, economical manner of someone who reviews documents for a living and has developed a low tolerance for imprecision in both paperwork and conversation. I explained what I needed. A forensic comparison between Sylvia's authenticated signature on our 2019 will and the signatures on 2 of Chris's documents, plus an independent legal analysis of the trust instrument, specifically the trustee authority provisions and revocation conditions. She reviewed both documents for 4 minutes without speaking. The signatures, she said, are not from the same person. I know. I need that in writing. She quoted $1. Lambe. I paid on the spot. Written opinion within 10 days. She said. I walked out onto Meeting Street. 2 professionals were now working on my behalf. Neither had known me before this week. Neither owed me anything beyond the service I was paying them to provide. Exactly the arrangement I wanted. Clean transactions between strangers hold up better in documentation. And documentation was going to matter. I drove home, on Calhoun Street. I passed the First National Bank of Carolina without stopping. Nothing to do there yet. But I noted it, back in the basement. I pulled the chronometer toward me. The escapement wheel was clean. Each tooth measured. The next component was the balance spring, the coiled strip of metal that regulates the rhythm of the movement. A balance spring that has been slightly bent produces an error that compounds. A minute off per day becomes an hour off per month. Small distortions left uncorrected eventually make the whole instrument unreliable. I thought about the word temporarily. 3 years ago, I had watched the slow reorganization of spaces and decisions I'd previously considered mine. Mail collected before I came downstairs. Financial conversations I wasn't included in. Sylvia growing quieter about accounts I'd thought I understood. I had noticed all of it and done something I very rarely allowed myself in 31 years of professional work. I had assumed good faith. That assumption had cost Sylvia 2 years of carrying something alone. The phone rang at 7:15. Rebecca. Dad. The concerned register. The one that sounds like worry and functions like pressure. I've been thinking about you. Are you eating, sleeping okay? I'm managing fine. I said. It's just Chris mentioned the documents are still in sign. He's not trying to push you. He just wants to make sure nothing gets complicated. Apparently, there are tax implications the longer we wait after a death in the family. And tax implications, I said. That's what he says. I don't know all the specifics. But Chris handles these situations. And he's genuinely concerned about the timeline. I picked up a small file from the workbench and turned it in my fingers. Outside the basement window, the last light was going out of the sky over the rooftops. Rebecca. I said. I understand. A pause. So? You'll sign. I said. I understand the situation. I said. That's all. Longer pause. I could hear her recalibrating. Okay. She finally said. I love you. Dad. Good night. Rebecca. I set the phone on the bench and went back to the balance spring. It had 13 coils. I began counting them carefully, holding the movement up under the lamp, somewhere on Broad Street. I was reasonably certain Chris was receiving a report at that moment. The old man is stalling. He says he understands, but won't commit. We may need another approach. I set the chronometer down on its rest and looked at the lamp above the bench for a moment. They thought I was grieving. They thought grief made a person soft and slow and manageable. In my experience, grief does exactly one thing with any reliability. It removes everything that isn't essential and leaves you with a very clear picture of what actually matters. I had a quick claim deed I hadn't authorized. I had a signature that wasn't my wife's. I had a registered LLC I'd never heard of, run by my son-in-law's older brother. and somewhere at the bottom of a safe upstairs, I had a sealed yellow envelope I still hadn't opened. The clock on the wall read 8:43, 12 days, until Patricia Ward's written opinion, 14 days until Conrad Hayes's first report. Plenty of time. I had always preferred to be patient. Let me go back to the morning after the funeral. I need to do this properly because the sequence matters. When I opened the safe that first morning, before Hayes, before Ward, before the cafe on King Street, I found two things that Sylvia had left for me. The first was the purple folder with her handwritten instructions. Check the LLC. Look at the signatures. Compare with the 2019 will that I've already described. But the purple folder was not the last item in the safe. At the very bottom, beneath the velvet roll of jewelry and the insurance documents, lay something else. A heavy envelope of thick yellow paper sealed with a circle of dark wax written across the front in Sylvia's black marker, in capital letters deliberate enough that you couldn't misread a single one. Do not open until they ask for money. I had stood there that first morning holding it and made a decision. She had given a specific condition. Chris had asked for a signature, but not for money. Restructuring. He'd said, does administrative matters. Not money. I put the envelope back, closed the safe, went to the basement, and thought, that was then. 2 weeks had now passed. Hayes and Ward were both working. I had sat across from Chris in a coffee shop and watched him present 3 instruments designed to strip me of this house. A $320,000 insurance policy, and a $412,000 investment account, and said only, I'll need a week. Rebecca had called that same evening and used the phrase tax implications as a lever, and then 2 evenings ago she called again. Dad, Chris has run the numbers. If the estate doesn't transfer management of the investment account within the next 10 days, the tax exposure could run to $60 or $70. Ling, ling, ling. We're talking about your money. Dad, money you'd be losing. He's trying to protect you. There it was, in precise numerical terms, what it would cost me not to sign. That was close enough to asking for the money. I told Rebecca I'd think about it and ended the call. Then I went upstairs, opened the safe with the April 14th combination, and retrieved the yellow envelope for the second time. I carried it down to the basement, sat on the stool under the lamp, and held it in both hands for a while. I thought about the woman who had assembled whatever was inside, page by page, over nearly 2 years, while saying nothing to me. Then I broke the wax seal. The envelope contained 47 pages. I set them on the workbench and went through them one at a time. Pages 1 through 14. Bank statements from an account registered to Magnolia Home Solutions LLC at a Columbia address. Deposits ranging from $4,000 to $31 $000 dated across a 2.5 year period. Several entries included reference numbers I recognized as originating from our joint investment account. Our money routed into a company I'd never heard of. Pages 15 through 22. Printed email exchanges. Most were between Chris and an address I didn't recognize. Presumably Derek. The language was careful. Nothing that would survive a sophistication test in isolation. But the pattern was legible to someone accustomed to reading financial correspondence for concealed intent. Move the second tranche before end of Q3. The trust documents are ready for her signature whenever she's ready. Her Sylvia. Pages 23 through 31. Photocopies of signed documents. Most carried Sylvia's real signature. The leftward S. The closed C. But I stopped on page 23. Page 23 was a photocopy of a document titled Partial Interest Transfer Residential Property. The address listed for Wentworth Lane. The instrument conveyed 18% of the ownership interest in the property to Magnolia Home Solutions LLC. At the bottom on the line marked owner, Greetor was a signature that looked exactly like mine. The date at the top read the 14th of November. 2 years prior, I was in Savannah that week. A weekend trip to examine a marine chronometer that turned out to be a reproduction. I have a hotel receipt. I have a restaurant receipt. I have a phone record that places me in Chatham County the entire weekend. I was not in Charleston on that date. I did not sign that document. I turned to page 47. Sylvia's handwritten notes. 2 pages, front and back, numbered to correspond with each page in the archive. Against page 23. She had written, Evas in Zavana. I checked the hotel records. This signature is not his. She had known. She had documented it and said nothing because she was protecting me from something she wasn't sure I could handle without doing something that would cost us more than the document itself. She was probably right about that. I stacked all 47 pages, tapped them square against the workbench, and set them in order. The broken wax seal lay beside them on the bench. I sat there for a while without moving. The lamp over the bench made a small circle of light in the darker room. Outside, the street was quiet. A car passed. Then nothing. I thought about the mechanics of what I was now looking at. Not suspicion. Not inference. But documentation. A photocopy of a forged signature. A hotel record placing me somewhere else on the date that signature allegedly appeared. 2 years of financial transactions flowing through a company I hadn't known existed. Funded in part by accounts attached to my name, in my former line of work. This was called a package. All the elements organized and indexed, ready to hand to a prosecutor. Sylvia hadn't been a federal investigator. She had been a retired school teacher with a head for numbers and a very strong sense of what was wrong. She had built a package anyway, because she knew I would know what to do with one. I picked up the last page, her handwritten notes, and read through them one more time. The following morning, the phone rang before I'd finished my coffee. Chris. Ernie. Same frequency. Varm. Brisk. The voice of a man who starts from a position of assumed advantage. I wanted to follow up on what Rebecca mentioned. Have you had a chance to think things over? I was at the kitchen window. The Aylas along the back fence were coming up early. She mentioned 60 or 70. 0 inches tax exposure. I said, that's the rough estimate. Window is closing. I'd really like to sit down today. In my left hand was the yellow envelope. Opened. 47 pages photographed. Uploaded to a password-protected cloud account. And copied to a USB drive in the inside pocket of my winter coat. Come by at 3. I said, bring whatever you have. I texted Patricia Ward one additional document to add to the review list. 9:00 tomorrow. She confirmed in 4 minutes. Then I sat at the study desk with Chris's original folder and went through the trust instrument line by line. In Section 4, Subsection C, the provision governing the nature of the property transfer, I found what I was looking for. His version used the word irrevocable. Once signed, the interest was gone. Non reversal. No recours. I found a clean sheet of paper and a pen. A 2:45. I heard Chris's car in the driveway. He came through the front door. He had a key and found his way to the study. He set his bag on the chair and sat across from me. Not quite smiling, but carrying the posture of a man who expects the conversation to land in his favor. Coffee. I poured from the car, set it in front of him, sat back down. Tell me more about Magnolia Home Solutions. I said. Something crossed his face. It lasted less than a second. A fractional tightening around the eyes. A micro-hesitation in the jaw. And then it was gone. Replaced by practiced composure. Property management entity. He said. Derek set it up a few years ago. Standard vehicle for consolidating real property under a single management structure. Lower administrative overhead. Cleaner tax treatment. He lifted the coffee cup. Specific aspect you're unclear on. The beneficiaries. I said, who benefits from that entity? Pause. Shorter than the first one. Derek is the nominal director. It's structured primarily as an administrative vehicle. The economics flow through the trust, and the 18% interest in this property that was transferred to Magnolia Home Solutions 2 years ago. I said, how does that factor in? His hands, resting on the desk, did not move. His face did not change. But his eyes did something, a rapid flicker of recalculation. The kind that happens when a man realizes the ground has shifted under him and needs a half second to find his footing. I'm not sure what you're referring to. He said, The partial interest transfer document, I said, signed on the 14th of November. 2 years ago, 18% of 4 Wentworth Lane to Magnolia Home Solutions LLC. It carries my signature. He looked at me steadily. That was part of the preliminary restructuring. Standard step in the process. I was in Savannah that week. I said. The room was very quiet. Through the study window. The Aylas were pale pink against the fence. I have a hotel receipt, I said, and a restaurant receipt and a phone record showing I was in Chatham County the entire weekend. Chris set down his coffee cup. His hands were steady. I noticed he was working to keep them that way. His voice dropped 10% of its warmth and picked up something harder underneath. Ernest. I think there may be some confusion about the sequencing of, my signature is on a document I didn't sign. I said, on a date I wasn't in this city. That's not a sequencing issue. Chris, that's a different kind of problem altogether. He held my gaze. Then he reached into the bag and placed his folder on the desk. The same 3 documents plus a cover letter on Palmetto Wealth Advisors' letterhead. Why don't we focus on moving forward? The new documents correct any prior issues. Signed today. Close the loop. Nothing further to resolve. He was good. I'll give him that. Direct hit, absorbed. Objective maintained. Composure intact. I picked up my pen and opened the folder to the first document. Chris watched. Hands still on the table. Expression neutral and patient. A man who has decided the simplest path is to wait out the other person's hesitation. I read every page. Then I signed the first document. Then the second. Then the third. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. I saw it in the slight drop of his shoulders. One involuntary fraction of an inch. He gathered the pages with an efficiency that bordered on unseemly, tapped them straight, and slid them back into the folder. I appreciate this. Ernest, I know it's been a lot to process. It has. I agreed. He left 15 minutes later. I heard his car back out and pull away. I sat for a moment. Then I opened the desk drawer, removed the folder I had placed there that morning, and looked at the 3 pages inside. Not Chris's documents, but the copies I had prepared, copies with one modification in Section 4. Subsection C, where his original read, irrevocable. Mine read revocably. 1 word. 7 letters. The difference between a permanent surrender and a door I could still open from my side. I had not signed Chris's documents. I had signed mine. That evening, a text from Rebecca arrived. Chris says, everything is settled. Thank you. Dad. I love you. I set the phone on the workbench beside the chronometer. The balance spring had 13 coils. I'd already counted them twice. I started again from the beginning. The call from Conrad Hayes came on a Tuesday morning. 3 weeks after the funeral, I was on my morning walk along East Bay Street when my phone buzzed. I stepped off the path and stood looking at the harbor while he talked. He spoke for about 12 minutes. I didn't interrupt. Hayes had found 3 things. The first, 214美元. 000, had passed through Magnolia Home Solutions LLC accounts over the preceding 2.5 years. He had traced a substantial portion to the liquidation of an investment fund that Sylvia had held in her name since 1998. The fund had been restructured. That was the word used in the transfer documentation. Into a vehicle that channeled, proceeds through Magnolia, and from there into Low Country Asset Partners. The Delaware entity registered solely to Christopher Bennett. The restructuring paperwork bore Sylvia's signature. Hayes noted that the transaction sequencing suggested the signatures had been obtained under time pressure, a pattern he described as consistent with what he called cooperative coercion. Not a legal term, but a useful one. The second, Low Country Asset Partners, registered in Delaware, listed Christopher A. Bennett as the sole beneficial owner. Its stated purpose was real estate acquisition and development consulting. In 2.5 years of existence, it had acquired no real estate and performed no documented consulting. What it had done was receive $214,000 and distribute approximately $129,000 to a personal account registered to Christopher A. Bennett at a Hilton Head Bank branch. The third, Hayes had located 2 additional LLCs registered in the names of Derek and Christopher Bennett, both formed in the prior 3 years, both using variations of the same Delaware registered agent service, both dormant, except for a small number of transactions that Hayes characterized as consistent with structuring. I knew what structuring meant. It's the practice of breaking transactions into amounts below federal reporting thresholds to avoid detection. It is also, by itself, a federal offense. I thanked Hayes, told him to document everything with source citations, and asked for a written report by end of week. Then I stood there for a moment watching a pelican work its way along the waterline below the sea wall. 214美元. Ling ling ling. Our money. The money that Sylvia and I had put away across 4 decades. Saved carefully. Invested conservatively. Protected from every instinct to spend it on things we didn't need. Gone into a company run by her son-in-law's older brother. And from there, into her son-in-law's personal bank account. Over 2.5 years. While she watched, documented, and said nothing because she was waiting for me to be in a position to do something about it. I finished the walk. 2 days later, I had Patricia Ward's written opinion in my hand. 7 pages dense, with legal citations and a 3-page appendix of signature comparison analysis. Her conclusions were stated with the careful, hedged precision that good, professional opinions always carry. But the substance was unambiguous. 2 of the signatures attributed to Sylvia on documents in Chris's folder were in Ward's professional assessment. Inconsistent with authenticated exemplars to a degree that warrants further expert examination and strongly suggests they were not produced by the same individual. 1 additional signature she assessed as potentially genuine, but obtained under circumstances suggesting undue influence or duress, citing specific characteristics of the signing context. As described in Sylvia's own notes, I drove to the federal building on Meeting Street. Marcus Turner had moved offices since I'd last seen him. He was on the 3rd floor now. A corner room with a view of the parking structure. He was 41, still carrying the precise, unhurried manner he'd had as a junior agent when I'd worked with him a decade prior. He stood when I came in, which was a formality neither of us required, and gestured to the chair across from his desk. He sate the folder on his desk. "You're going to want to look at this." He did. He read for 40 minutes while I sat across from him and looked at the wall. He made no sounds of surprise. He made very few sounds at all. When he set the last page down, he looked at me for a moment. 2 LLCs in South Carolina. 1 in Delaware, he said, and structuring patterns on at least 2 of them. The forged signatures. You have an independent professional opinion. In the folder, he looked at the folder for another moment. Wire fraud. Forgery. Potentially coercion. And the structuring at minimum. I said. He nodded slowly. Give us 2 weeks. I drove home. The documents Chris had presented, his originals, the ones he'd believed I had signed, were in the desk drawer in the study. The ones I'd actually signed with the single-word modification were in the same drawer. Locked. The difference between irrevocable and revocable in Section 4, subsection C was 7 letters, and, in practical terms, the difference between Chris believing he controlled the property transfer and the reality that I could unwind it at any time with a simple written notice. He didn't know that yet. As far as Chris was concerned, the old man had signed. Everything was proceeding. I went to the basement. I had been working on the balance spring for 2 weeks. It was finally seated correctly. I attached it to the balance wheel and set the assembly back into the movement. Then used the micrometer to check the end shake. Within tolerance, a week after my visit to Turner, Chris's car appeared in the driveway at 11:00 inches the morning. Unannounced. I heard it from the basement. I heard the front door. He still had his key. And his footsteps on the stairs to the ground floor. And then the creak of the 3rd step from the bottom. As he came down, he appeared in the doorway of the workshop. His jacket was on, which he almost never wore around the house. His jaw was set. The smile was entirely absent. "You changed the document," he said. I was at the workbench fitting a small gear back into the barrel bridge of the movement. I didn't look up immediately. I signed what you brought me. I said, the trust instrument, section four. You changed irrevocable to revocable. His voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it. A compressed quality. The sound of a managing a temperature he doesn't want visible. The Charleston County Register of Deeds rejected the quitclaim filing this morning. Clerical error in the transfer provision. The clerk flagged it before I even left the building. I set the gear in its seat and picked up a small screwdriver. Sounds like a paperwork problem. Ernest. He took 2 steps into the room. I need you to sign the corrected version today. I looked up at him. Then I want to be precise about what I saw. Not rage. Not panic. But the specific expression of a man who has realized that the situation is not what he believed it to be, and is running very fast through his options. His hands were at his side, open. His breathing was slightly faster than normal. His eyes had lost the practiced warmth entirely and showed something sharper and colder underneath, the thing that had always been there, now visible for the first time without its cover. I'll think about it, I said. He stood there for a moment. Then he picked up his bag and walked out of the basement without another word. I heard his car reverse out of the driveway. I went back to the barrel bridge. 4 days later, a letter arrived by certified mail. The return address was a law office on Broad Street. Parsons and Associates. The letter informed me, in the formal language that attorneys use when they want something to sound routine while implying consequences, that my son-in-law, Christopher Bennett, they was requesting my cooperation in completing a properly executed trust transfer and property conveyance, that my previous signing had contained a material error, and that I was expected to provide a corrected signature within 10 days. The letter referenced the Bennett-Coleman Joint Management Trust and described the transfer as consistent with prior verbal agreements between the parties. I read the letter twice. Verbal agreements. That was interesting. I called Patricia Ward. She reviewed the letter and added it to my file. That same week, Turner called. We have enough for the warrant, he said. Wanted you to know. Appreciate it. I said, I didn't ask for details. It wasn't my case. It had been mine to build and his to run. And the line between those two things matters. Rebecca had stopped answering my calls 4 days after Chris's visit to the workshop. Her phone went to voicemail, then stopped accepting messages. I wasn't surprised. I was, in a particular way I hadn't expected. Sad about it, not devastated, not bitter, but sad in the way you're sad. When you watch something you hoped would hold together, finally, come apart along a seam you'd seen for years. I called once more, got voicemail, and didn't leave a message. The following Monday, I drove to Ward's office on Meeting Street and found a thick envelope waiting for me at the front desk. She had filed a civil complaint in Charleston County Court requesting the judicial invalidation of all documents bearing forged or coerced signatures attributable to Sylvia Coleman, the annulment of the Magnolia Home Solutions, LLC's purported interest in the property at Fort Wentworth Lane, and compensatory damages, to be assessed pending a full accounting of assets transferred through both shell entities. The filing ran to 22 pages. I took the envelope home and read it. 22 pages. Organized. Well-cited. Methodical. I put it in the desk drawer and locked it. 3 days later, a courier delivered a second certified envelope. The return address was Parsons and Associates again. This one was not a request. It was a formal notice of counterclaim. Christopher Bennett alleged that I had, in multiple verbal conversations spanning 3 years, expressly agreed to the full transfer of property and financial assets to the Bennett-Coleman Joint Management Trust, and that my resistance to completing those transfers constituted a breach of oral agreement, causing him material financial harm. I set the envelope on the workbench and looked at it. Verbal agreements. He was claiming conversations that had allegedly occurred across 3 years of family discussions. No documentation. No witnesses named. Just the assertion made formally, and with legal representation that I had said things I hadn't said. It was a reasonable move if you were in his position. He had no good moves left that I could see. But this one was at least rational. Introduce enough ambiguity about prior consent that a proceeding becomes complicated, expensive, and slow. Make me doubt whether the cost of continuing is worth it. I picked up the envelope and put it in the desk drawer with the others. Then I went to the basement, sat down at the bench, and thought about page 47 of Sylvia's archive, the email, the one Chris had sent his brother in September of 2023 before any of the critical documents had been signed. The one that began, "The old man has no idea." He had been right at the time. I wound the movement carefully, set the hands, and listened to the escapement begin to tick. He wasn't right anymore. Chris's counterclaim rested on a single premise: that Ernest Coleman had, in multiple verbal conversations across 3 years of family life, expressly and repeatedly agreed to transfer his property and financial assets to the Bennett-Coleman Joint Management Trust. No written record, no emails, no signed memoranda of understanding. Just the assertion filed formally with legal representation behind it that I had said things I hadn't said in rooms that contain no witnesses except the people making the claim. In theory, this is difficult to disprove. Verbal agreements in domestic settings leave no paper trail. A confident assertion backed by legal representation can bog down proceedings and cost the defending party enough in fees that they decide the fight isn't worth it. Make it expensive and slow. That's the calculation. It was rational, under ordinary circumstances. It might have worked. These were not ordinary circumstances. I carried page 47 from the basement shelf to the kitchen table. I had read it several times already. But I read it again. I find precision calming. It was a print out of an email sent from Christopher Bennett's personal address to Derek's roughly 18 months before any of the critical documents had been signed. The subject line read, "Timeline update." The body of the email read in its entirety, "Old man has no idea. Sylvia will sign. She always signs when we give her enough time and the right framing. Just need to pick the right moment. D. Make sure the LLC is fully papered before Q1. We don't want anything that looks rushed." I read it once more. Then I photographed it, added it to the existing cloud archive, and drove to Patricia Ward's office on Meeting Street. She read the printout. Then she read it again. "This was in the archive your wife assembled," she said. "Page 47. I said. She printed it and added it to the file, approximately 14 months before she passed. Ward looked at me over her glasses. "This is direct evidence of intent prior to any of the contested transactions. I thought you'd find it useful." She picked up her phone and called the Federal Chorus's public information line to confirm filing procedures for supplemental evidence in an active proceeding. Then she called Turner's office. I left her to it and drove to the Federal building. Turner was already aware of the email by the time I arrived. Ward had reached his assistant while I was parking. He came out to meet me in the lobby, which he hadn't done before, and walked me back to his office without the usual wait. "The email establishes premeditation," he said, setting my copy on the desk beside the existing file, "and it directly contradicts the counterclaim." I said, "If I had no idea what was happening." His words. "Then I wasn't agreeing to anything." Turner nodded slowly. "We've been building toward this. The wire fraud count is solid. The forgery is solid. The structuring adds a third angle." He looked at the email printout. "This closes the loop on intent." 2 days later, Turner called me at 7 inches the morning. "We picked up Derek Bennett in Columbia last night. He said he's cooperating." I poured a second cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table. Derek had been offered a cooperation agreement to reduce charges in exchange for testimony, and accepted within 4 hours. His attorney had apparently advised him that his position as nominal director of both entities made him materially liable, and that cooperating early was considerably preferable to the alternative. I thanked Turner and ended the call. Derek Bennett had been promised $85,000 for lending his name to his brother's scheme. He'd received about $23,000 before things unraveled. He traded his record for less than a quarter of what he'd been promised. I almost felt something about that. Almost. The following week, a letter arrived from Parsons and Associates, Stephen Parsons was withdrawing from Chris's representation, effective immediately. Citing irreconcilable differences of professional opinion, attorneys don't walk away from active cases without reason. Parsons had presumably reviewed the evidence and made a calculation about his own exposure. I added the letter to the desk drawer. That evening, my phone rang. Rebecca. I looked at the screen for a moment. Then I answered. She was crying, not the constructed, pressured crying of someone trying to move a negotiation, but the raw, uncontrolled kind that doesn't calculate its effect. She said my name twice before she could organize a sentence. Dad, I need to talk to you. I'm listening. I said, I knew about the restructuring. I knew about the trust. I thought it was estate planning. That it was the right thing to do for the taxes for everybody. Her voice broke and steadied and broke again. But I didn't know about the signatures. The ones that weren't real. I swear I didn't know about those. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the window. Outside, the street was quiet. The alia bushes along the back fence had finished their bloom and were just green now. Holding their shape against the fence in the last of the evening light, I thought about whether I believed her. I thought about it carefully and honestly. The way I tried to think about things I couldn't afford to get wrong. Rebecca, I said, the court will determine what you knew. The line was silent for several seconds. I know, she said finally. Very quietly, get yourself a good attorney. I said, someone independent. Not Parsons. I ended the call and sat for a while in the quiet kitchen. The federal hearing took place on a Thursday morning in the middle of a warm month in a courtroom on the third floor of the federal courthouse, 2 blocks from the harbor. I sat in the gallery. I was not a party to the criminal proceeding. I was a complaining witness, which meant my role was to be present and available, not to perform. Christopher Bennett sat at the defense table in a dark suit that fit him precisely. His attorney was a man I didn't recognize, someone brought in from Colombia after Parsons withdrew. Younger, less assured. Chris's posture was controlled. His expression was controlled. Everything about him was controlled. Because control was the mechanism he had always relied on. And there was a specific kind of person who maintains the forms of composure even as everything underneath them comes apart. The proceeding was methodical, conducted in the unhurried language of federal court. Derek's 9-page sworn statement was read into the record. Ward's signature analysis entered as expert testimony. The email from page 47, "Old man has no idea," was entered as Government Exhibit 14. When it was read aloud, I watched Chris. He was looking at the table. His jaw was set, his hands folded and still. But something happened around his eyes. A tightening. A compression. The expression of a man who has heard the thing that closes the last door. 3 seconds. Then his face went smooth. He had practiced that. He had probably been practicing it his entire life. He was still good at it right up to the end. The verdict came back in the afternoon of the second day. Guilty on 2 counts of wire fraud under federal statute, and guilty on 1 count of forgery of documents under South Carolina law. The judge set sentencing for 6 weeks later. The eventual sentence was 4 years in federal custody and $214. 0 inches restitution to the estate of Sylvia Coleman and Ernest Coleman. I was in the hallway when Chris was walked out. His attorney spoke to him in a low, rapid voice. Chris wasn't responding, just looking at the middle distance with that same controlled expression. Then he looked directly at me. I didn't smile. I looked back at him until his attorney steered him toward the exit. That was enough. Magnolia Home Solutions LLC and Low Country Asset Partners were dissolved by court order within 3 weeks of the verdict. All documents bearing forged signatures, including the partial interest transfer that had placed 18% of my house into an entity I'd never authorized, were judicially annulled. The insurance policy reverted to its original beneficiary designation. The investment account, minus the $214,000 that would come back through restitution, was restored to its original management structure. Derek Bennett received a suspended sentence and a $40,000. Fine. It was in Colombia. I had no plans to think about him further. Rebecca was not charged. She had retained an attorney in Greenville. No connection to any of the prior proceedings, and had cooperated as a witness for the prosecution. Her testimony was limited but useful. She confirmed the timeline of discussions about the trust, confirmed that she had been present for several document signings, and confirmed that Chris had handled all communication with Derek directly and had not included her in those conversations. Whether she had known about the forged signatures or not, the prosecution didn't need to prove it either way. They had enough without her. She appeared on my doorstep on a Saturday afternoon in the month following the verdict, carrying one suitcase. She had driven from wherever she'd been staying. She hadn't told me, and I hadn't asked. She stood on the front step, looking at me with the particular expression of someone who has spent a long time preparing for a conversation and arrived to find they still don't know how to begin it. I looked at her for a moment. She was thinner than I remembered. She had her mother's eyes, which had always been Sylvia's most legible feature, the ones that told you what she was actually feeling when the rest of her face was trying to manage the presentation. "Come in," I said. "The coffee is in the same cabinet it's always been. I'll be in the basement." I turned and went back down the stairs. I heard her come inside. I heard the front door close. I heard her footsteps in the kitchen. The familiar sound of the cabinet opening. The particular click of the coffee maker starting up. In the basement, I sat down at the workbench and picked up the chronometer. It had taken me nearly 4 months from the morning after the funeral to the afternoon. I finished the final calibration. The movement was clean. Every component inspected, every damaged part replaced or repaired. The balance spring seated with the correct tension. The escapement ticking at the rate the maker had intended when it was built 160 years ago. I wound it one full turn and set the hands to the clock on the wall. Then I set it on the shelf above the workbench and listened. It ran steady and even, the tick marking each second with the precision it was designed to keep. Not fast, not slow. Exactly right. I sat there for a while listening to it. The house was quiet in the way it had been since March, but different now. Somehow, less empty. Rebecca was upstairs making coffee. The morning sun was coming through the small basement window and laying a strip of light across the floor of the workshop. I picked up the smallest screwdriver and began cleaning the tools one at a time, putting each one back in its place on the pegboard. If you like this story, subscribe to our new channel and listen to a few stories there. You can find the link to it in the collaboration or description of this video or in the comments. Subscribe so you don't lose us, because this channel may soon cease to exist.